The shot cracked through the pinewood silence, echoing like thunder rolling down from the ridgeline. Sheriff Kane's Colt .45 bucked in his hand, smoke curling into the cold morning air. For a heartbeat, he thought the figure in the trees was just another outlaw, another faceless threat. But when the man staggered out of the brush and fell hard against the frozen earth, Kane's breath caught in his chest. The hunter he'd shot was no stranger. It was Eli Kane, his own brother. The world seemed to tilt. Pine needles shivered under a gust of wind, scattering in silence. The forest smelled of gunpowder and resin, the kind of smell Kane had lived his whole life with. But now it clung to him like a curse. Eli's eyes were wide, the same steel gray as Kane's, but clouded with pain. Blood seeped hot and dark through his hunting coat, staining the earth in a slow, widening circle. His voice rasped like gravel scraped over iron. "You always were quicker on the draw, brother." Kane dropped to one knee beside him, the silver badge on his duster catching the pale light filtering through the branches. His scar itched, the old one that ran from jaw to neck, as if it too remembered the history buried between them. "I didn't know it was you," Kane said, voice flat but trembling at the edges. He pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the sticky warmth of blood seeping between his fingers. "Why in God's name didn't you call out?" Eli coughed, a weak smile twisting his lips despite the pain. "Because I was being hunted too. Thought maybe you were one of them." "Who?" Kane demanded, his voice low and fierce. Eli's head rolled to the side, eyes blinking against the harsh light slanting through the pines. His words came in broken pieces. Marshals' men, courthouse ledgers, names they don't want spoken. I found them, Kane. Thought I could bring it to you, but—" He coughed again, a spray of red staining his chin. "They found me first." Kane's stomach dropped, a chill colder than the mountain wind cutting through his coat. His brother had been gone for years, a drifter who'd traded family for freedom. Now he lay bleeding at Kane's feet, whispering secrets about powerful men, corruption, and treachery rooted deep in the law Kane had sworn to uphold. The sheriff glanced around the forest, every nerve alive. The air felt too still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere far off, a raven called, its cry harsh and mocking. "You're not dying here," Kane muttered, his voice low. "Not in these damn woods." He tried to hoist Eli onto his shoulder, the hunter's rifle clattering into the pine needles. But Eli grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, his grip like iron forged in desperation. "No, listen," Eli hissed, each word costing him breath. "They'll come. They know I was close. You need to bury the truth, Kane, or fight for it. Either way, blood will spill." "Shut your mouth," Kane snapped, though his eyes burned. "Save your strength." But Eli's gaze was locked on him, unflinching despite the pain. "You always clung to that badge, thought it meant something, but law without justice is just a shackle. You'll have to choose, brother, badge or blood." Kane froze. The words struck deeper than any bullet could. The silver badge felt heavy on his chest, the pine-scented air pressing down like judgment. His mind flashed back to the past, the two boys racing horses across open prairie, his father's calloused hand guiding theirs on a rifle. The night everything burned, and Kane swore never to let lawlessness rule again. And Eli, storming out into the night after their father's burial, spitting the words, "You chose their law over our blood. I'll never forgive you." That wound had never healed. And now here it was, bleeding in the dirt. The crack of a twig snapped Kane's attention up. His hand went to the Colt instinctively, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Shapes moved between the trees, too deliberate to be deer. He caught the glint of metal in the underbrush, a rifle barrel catching a sliver of sunlight. Eli's grip tightened. They're here. Stay down, Kane ordered, voice flat, cold as steel. He dragged his brother behind the trunk of a fallen pine, the bark rough under his gloves. The sheriff crouched low, eyes scanning the shifting shadows. His heartbeat pounded like a war drum, steadying into the rhythm he knew too well, the rhythm of men about to kill or be killed. A voice carried through the trees, calm, mocking. "Sheriff Kane, thought we might find you out here." The sound slithered across the clearing, carried by the wind. Kane knew that voice. Marshal Dugan, federal badge and all, a man whose authority reached further than the county line. The kind of man settlers feared more than outlaws, because his power came wrapped in law. "You're harboring a fugitive," Dugan called, his tone almost casual. "Step aside and hand him over. Hunter named Eli Kane, wanted for murder." Kane's jaw tightened. Murder. That word didn't sit right. Eli was many things, reckless, bitter, a man who'd walked away from family, but he wasn't a murderer, not in the way Dugan meant. The marshal's men moved into position, shadows with rifles, the click of iron hammers carrying sharp in the crisp air. Kane spun his badge between his fingers, a habit that always came when choice pressed heavy on his shoulders. Law ain't always justice. He whispered under his breath, words like a vow, but justice rides with me. He slid the Colt back into his hand, the pearl handle gleaming faintly. Eli lay pale and trembling behind the pine, whispering his brother's name like a final prayer. Kane rose from cover, the morning sun striking his black hat and coat, turning him into a stark figure against the trees, his voice carried, hard as the barrel in his hand. "You want Eli Kane," he said, every word cutting the air. "You'll have to go through me." The forest went still. Even the raven had gone quiet. And then, another rifle cocked, another step in the brush, a dozen eyes watching. The noose was tightening. Pine sap bled down the bark like amber tears, while Kane pressed his palm to Eli's wound and counted the breaths between distant clicks of rifle hammers. The air bit with mountain cold. The ground smelled of crushed needles and iron. Somewhere, a branch creaked like a rope swaying in wind. "Stay with me," Kane said, his voice low. "You hear?" Eli's eyes fluttered. "Ain't the first time we heard men loading guns behind trees." The words dragged open an old door. Dust, heat, a July sun beating the prairie flat as hammered tin. 12-year-old Kane and 14-year-old Eli crouched behind a fallow stone fence, while their father, Harlan Kane, peered across the yellow grass at 3 bandits roping cattle that wore the wrong brand. The boys' shirts stuck to their backs. Grasshoppers clicked and leapt like sparking cinders. "Law's a fence," Harlan murmured, not looking at them. "Justice is the post it's hung on. You take one without the other, and all you've got is wire cut in flesh." He thumbed back the hammer of his rifle. "We bring 'em in, alive." Eli's jaw tightened. "They stole from us." His voice cracked with that edge boys get when they want to be men. "They deserve a rope, Pa." Harlan's eyes flicked to him. Calm, sad somehow. "Rope is the last word, son. Not the first." They went at dusk, the shadows long and softening. Harlan moved like a man who knew where the ground would hold and where it would give. When the shooting started, it was quick, pointless, ugly. The cattle broke. The bandits ran. Harlan put 2 down with clean shoulder shots that spun them into the grass and left them yelling. The third, small, fast, fired blind from the belly of a mesquite and caught Harlan with a round high under the collarbone. Kane could still hear that sound. Not a cry, a breath, leaving the body through blood. They dragged Harlan back while the bandit fled hard for the river. Eli wanted to go. He was already up, his boots taking dirt. Kane grabbed his brother's sleeve. "Pa needs us." Eli wrenched free, eyes bright with a furious kind of water. "You hold him, I'll fetch justice." He went and never caught the man. When Eli returned at dawn, Harlan Kane was cold. The boys sat with their father under a white sheet that the wind lifted and dropped like a weak lung. At noon, the town built a gallows for the 2 wounded bandits who'd lived. Kane remembered the first groan of rope on wood. He remembered Eli beside him, face like carved granite, whispering, "Should have been 3. He remembered promising himself he'd never again be too late for the last breath, the one that might matter. Wind scraped through the pines and the present snapped back. Kane tore a strip from his duster, found the artery, cinched a tourniquet high. Eli hissed and tried to rip his hand free, but his strength was water slipping between fingers. "Listen." Kane leaned close. "Where's that ledger?" Eli's mouth twitched toward a grin that didn't make it to his eyes. "Thought you'd already found it. Same place you put all your secrets, brother, inside your conscience." Eli. "Satchel," he whispered. "Bottom false seam." Kane reached under the fallen pine and hooked the leather strap. The satchel was stiff with sap and travel dust. He cut the seam with Eli's old bone-handled knife, its handle worn to the shape of their childhood, and slid out a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Names, transactions, notations in a tidy hand. The courthouse seal stamped on more than 1 page, handshakes on paper that stank worse than any latrine, and a name that tightened his grip. Dugan, half hidden in a column of freight payments that weren't quite freight. Rifles, rail contracts, wages withheld from Apaches declared hostile by men who'd lit the fuse themselves. "God help us," Kane breathed. Eli's laugh was a ghost in winter. "God's busy, Sheriff." A gunshot popped in the distance. Bark spat from a trunk just left of Kane's shoulder. He flattened over Eli as another round hissed high, whining through needles. The replies came from farther off, probing, careful, men drawing a noose, testing where it tightened. Kane slid them deeper into the shadows of the blowdown and waited, counting the rhythm of the search. He needed minutes. He had maybe 3. "Do you remember Drywater Bridge?" he asked, not looking at Eli. The question took them both back. A wash cut the prairie like a scar. Cottonwoods knotted their roots into the bank. The town had a man dangling from a beam they'd thrown across those trees. Someone accused of gunning a merchant during a card game. Kane, 21 and raw-boned, had ridden up with a half-dozen ranchers shouting for order. Eli, already drifting, already wearing the hunter's jacket, stood on a barrel under the man's boots with a knife raised to cut the rope. "He didn't do it," Eli said then, voice fierce. "They're stringing up the wrong man." "We'd take him to the jail," Kane said, feeling the new deputy star digging cold into his vest. "Let him answer to a judge." A woman screamed at the back of the crowd, "You ain't got the right." "By law, I do," Kane answered, heart pounding in a way that felt too much like fear of being wrong. The mob surged, Somebody shoved, somebody fired. No one ever agreed on who shot first. When the smoke cleared, the accused lay coughing in the dust. The rope cut. A boy with a red bandana bled out by the wheel hub. He couldn't have been older than 15. Eli looked at the body, then at Kane, and said in a voice like river rock, "Your law bent. It broke a little boy." Kane carried that boy to the church himself. He polished his badge that night until it flashed like a coin under lamplight, and promised never to let rage make the rope the first word. He believed it then, like a prayer. He believed it now. But belief had a cost. Rifles crept closer through the present. Kane's lungs burned with resin and cold. Sap stuck his hands. He slid the ledger back into the oilcloth, shoved it beneath the root-snarled tangle where no eye would see in weak daylight, and cupped Eli's cheek. "You're going to live long enough to testify," he said. "You hear me?" Eli managed a nod. "You always think words win, Sheriff." He coughed, swallowed blood. Sometimes only bullets listen. Kane's gaze snagged on a memory so sharp it stung. A small courthouse not yet painted, smelling of raw lumber. A judge with ink on his cuffs, pinning a silver badge to Kane's chest, while townsfolk clapped, and a lean figure in a hunter's coat slipped out the door. Kane followed him into rain. Eli stood under the eaves, smoke from his roll-up curling past his jaw like a question mark. "You put that on. You put us down," Eli said. "You ain't my brother no more. You're their brother." Kane had looked at the rain, at the mud, at the sway of an empty noose in the yard, where they'd hung 2 men 3 days prior. He'd said, "Somebody's got to put the rope away and lock it behind a door that opens slow." Eli had flicked his cigarette into a puddle. Doors lock easier on other people. Steps in the present, low voices, a wet sniffle of a horse. Kane leaned close so Eli could feel breath on his ear. "When I stand up, you keep still. You hear one of them come close, you play dead." Eli's mouth tugged. "Practice I've had." Kane rose, slow and smooth, until he could see through the lattice of broken limbs. 3 men ghosting between trunks, gray coats, one with a stovepipe hat pulled low against drizzle. The one in the hat paused, cupped a match handsomely, and lit a cigar. The smell of cheap tobacco wandered into the pine breath like something unclean. He didn't call out. He eased the Colt along the fallen trunk and sighted on the hat brim. The first shot would buy 10 seconds. The second, maybe 5. After that, trees and God. Behind him, Eli whispered, almost tender, "You remember the creek after Pa's funeral?" He did. Moonlight on black water, 2 brothers heaving stones into current until they couldn't lift their arms. Eli had said, "You make your vows, I'll make mine." Kane had sworn to the water and the sky, never again too late. Eli had sworn to the same sky, never again soft. "I remember," Kane said. "You keep your vows too hard," Eli breathed. "They'll break you." Kane adjusted the sight a hair. "Sheriff," a voice called. Too close. Not Dugan. Younger. Cocky. "Lay down your iron and step away from the body. The marshal wants the man and the book. You want to die for him. Do it where we can see your face." Kane stood into the open, rain pricking his cheeks like needles, the badge at his chest dull as pewter. He felt the tug of 30 years at his spine, a father's breath, a gallows creak, a boy's blood on wagon spokes, a courthouse laced with sawdust and vows. He raised his left hand so they could see it empty. He kept his right low by the trunk, the Colt's pearl grip kissing bark. "Come take him," he said. The man in the stovepipe hat smiled around his cigar and tipped the ash at his boot. Much obliged. The ledger's oilcloth crinkled faintly as a breeze nosed the roots. Kane caught the sound with a corner of his mind and saw the hat man's eyes shift, saw calculation spark. "Hold," Kane said, voice iron. "No one touches that tree." "Why not?" the hat man asked. "Got a squirrel buried under there?" A twig behind Kane's ear grazed hair. Cold metal pressed the notch of bone under his skull. "Drop the iron, Sheriff," a voice breathed, close enough to taste whiskey. "Now pick up that little bundle and hand it over, nice and slow." Kane's jaw tightened. He could see Eli's face beyond the fallen trunk, gray as frost, eyes bright with a terrible, lucid anger. He could feel the ghost of his father's hand on his shoulder and the gallows creaking somewhere in the bones of the trees. "Make your choice," the whisper behind him said. "Badge or blood." Kane let the Colt drop into the needles. It thudded once and lay smoking. He bent to the roots with rain ticking on the brim of his hat, fingers reaching for the oilcloth packet, and froze as Eli's knife, the old bone-handled one, sailed from the ground and pinned the wrist holding the pistol at Kane's skull straight into the pine. The man's scream split the rain. Guns came up from every shadow. The forest held its breath again, and then all the rifles spoke at once, before the echoes of rifle fire died in the pines. Sheriff Kane was already riding hard with Eli slumped across the withers of his gelding, blood soaking the horse's winter coat in a dark, sticky patch. Frost clung to the sage, and the morning felt brittle, the kind of cold that cracked puddles like glass. At the edge of Black Rock, the church bell tolled once, flat, tired, more iron than faith, and curtains twitched along Main Street as Kane thundered past. He should have taken his brother to the jail. That was the rule. Log the shot, summon a witness, notify the marshal. Instead, he shouldered through the side door of Doc Halverson's surgery, with his hat brim dripping frost, and his badge thudding against his chest like a second heart. "Back room," the old doctor barked, sleeves already rolled. Ether stung the air. His apprentice, a grave-eyed girl named Ruth, hauled a basin that steamed like a kettle in winter. Kane lay Eli on the table. Flesh hissed under poured carbolic. Eli's breath came in ragged freight bursts. "You put him here, and you will have to answer for it," Halverson said, voice low as he threaded a needle. Marshals already in town, rode in before dawn with 2 dragoons. Word is he was hunting a killer in the hills. Kane's jaw set. The image of Dugan's cigar smoke curling through the pines flashed behind his eyes. "He'll say my brother's the killer," Kane answered. "He'll say a lot of things." Eli stirred, murmuring, "Ledger, courthouse, don't let them." A tremor ran the length of his body, and his hand groped for Kane's wrist like a drowning man finding a post. "I've got you," Kane said, voice a shade softer than winter light. "Breathe." Outside, boots creaked on the boardwalk, voices braided into a low, unsteady rope. Whispers moved like wind through wheat. Sheriff shot his own blood. "Hunter. Brother. Too fast on the draw, that one." Kane scrubbed his hands in the sink until the cold bit bone. The steel-gray eyes he lifted to the cracked mirror were the same as Eli's, only harder. He took the oilcloth bundle from under his duster, Eli's ledger, and slid it beneath a loose floorboard Ruth pried up with a butter knife. She pressed the board down and set a ceramic chamber pot atop it, like any other forgettable thing. "No one seized him," Kane said. "No one if you keep men with badges out of my door," the doctor replied. I can't sew arteries and parry bayonets." Kane's badge spun once between his fingers while he listened to Eli's shallow breathing. Then he stepped out into the winter glare. Blackrock wore its secrets like dust. The gallows in the square leaned slightly from last autumn's winds, its ropes swaying with the lazy arrogance of a town reminder. The courthouse squatted across from it, brick red as a bloodshot eye. Freight wagons lined the road, Sutter and Kober stenciled on their sides, their canvas flaps beaded with cold. A mule stamped, metal shoes biting sparks from the stone. Kane mapped the shapes and angles out of habit, cover, escape, where a man could hide a rifle if he wanted to change a day into a nightmare. He walked into the saloon because that's where talk ripened quickest. Smoke hung low, cards slapped felt. The piano sat dumb with a tea towel over its teeth. He unbuttoned his coat but didn't hang it, feeling the weight of the Colt tugging at his hip like a promise he didn't want to keep. "Morning, Sheriff," the barkeep said, polishing a clean glass to keep his hands busy. "Cold enough to freeze a jackrabbit mid-hop." "Coffee," Kane said. He cut his glance toward a freight boss with mutton chops and a banker in a collar stiff enough to shave with. Both went suddenly interested in the far wall. A cowboy at the rail spat and missed the spittoon. "Reckon the law ought not to shoot kin," he muttered, too loud not to be heard. "Reckon men ought not to hide behind trees with rifles," Kane replied without looking. The room swallowed its own grin. He drifted to a table, laid his palm flat, and felt the lacquered grain, scarred by 1,000 temper slashes. The ledger's entries tabbed through his head. Names, weights, payments to ghost crews, Apache relocation services, a judge's signature, a marshal's initials that weren't quite initials, just enough ink to deny and enough to bind. The saloon door groaned. Marshal Dugan strode in like a man measuring a coffin, spurs complaining at each step, his federal badge bright as a cold star. He smelled of winter tobacco and oiled leather. 2 dragoons bracketed him, hats pulled low. "Sheriff Kane," Dugan smiled, and it never touched his eyes. "You look like sin on Sunday." "Marshal." Kane's voice was dry gravel. "A man bleeding back there in Halverson's care might disagree with your jokes." "Ah, yes. The hunter." Dugan sighed theatrically. "You interfered with federal pursuit. Man's wanted for killing a deputy near Clearwater. Your man. Hard thing." "Name the deputy," Kane said. "Records'll speak," Dugan answered lightly. "But since we're among friends..." His gaze swept the room like a broom. "Eli Kane is a murderer, and murder don't wipe off in carbolic." Quiet now. Even the cards seemed to hold their breath. Kane let his badge show. "Law says I hold him till a judge asks questions in daylight." Dugan's smile thinned. "This here's federal business." He traced his badge with one finger, as if polishing the Republic itself. "You ain't got the say-so." Kane's thumb stroked the pearl of his Colt. "Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me." Dugan's eyes cooled. Spoken like a man forgetting which side of the rope he keeps. He tipped 2 fingers off his hat and turned. At the door he paused, speaking toward the street. "Boys, post the notices." A dragoon slapped broadsides along the boardwalk. In cheap ink, "Wanted, Eli Kane, $500 dead or alive." Beneath it, in smaller hand, someone had added, "Harborers will be prosecuted." Kane finished the coffee and tasted grit. He crossed the street to the courthouse, passing the jailhouse with its black bars catching daylight like a web. Deputy Caro met him on the steps, wiping flour from his vest. He'd been eating pie and pretending the world didn't look back. "You're late to your own storm," Kane said. Caro swallowed. "Storm came with a federal sky, Sheriff. Judge Pritchard closed session early. Said the winter makes men stupid. Pritchard would know." Inside the courthouse, the records office smelled of paste and damp. Clerk Isaiah Reed, thin as a fence slat, spectacles fogged from hurrying, fumbled ledgers onto his desk. "Sheriff," he said, whispering like someone had taught his tongue fear, "if you're here about river permits or rail claims—" "I'm here about truth," Kane said, "and what men sell when they say process." The clerk's eyes darted to the door, then to a crate labeled Sutter & Co., resting beside the shelves. Its stencil matched Eli's ledger exactly. Same crooked serif on the ampersand, same run of the O. Kane tapped the wood with 2 knuckles. "How'd freight end up in a records room?" he asked. Isaiah swallowed. "Judge said the warehouse was full." A lie trying on its boots. Kane leaned in until the clerk could smell his tobacco. "Men with money and men with badges are sharing the same ink. You know it." A beat. Then Reed's shoulders sagged like soaked canvas. He pulled a ledger from under the counter. Not the county book, but a shadow mirror. Thin, neat, written in a hand that tried too hard to be nobody's. I keep a second record. For myself. Names and sums I wasn't told to write, official. If I vanish, I thought maybe someone—" He stopped, hands shaking. "Good," Kane said. "Copy the freight marks, everyone tied to Dugan, Pritchard, Sutter. Then put your book somewhere a match can't find." A woman's shout cut through the hallway, brittle as ice snapping. Kane and Reed lunged to the door. On the square, a knot of townsfolk had gathered around the notice board. A boy, barely 16, was nailing up the last poster, cheekbone already blooming purple. "Who hit you?" Kane asked. "Banker Locke." The boy sniffed, chin high. "Said I were hammering too slow." Kane looked past the boy to where Hiram Locke, vest tight, watch chain winking, chatted with Dugan. The banker's hands were clean. They always were. "Sheriff," a breathless voice hissed at his elbow. Ruth, the apprentice, face white as laundry. "Doctor says your brother's fever is rising, and men are nosing near the back alley, 2 of them, with boots that don't belong to our town." Kane's mind ran 3 roads at once. Guard, Eli. Secure the shadow ledger. Check the alley. He made his choice and felt the hinge in it. A little sound like destiny adjusting a spur. "Reed, get me a copy page and your pencil." He tore a sheet, shoved it into his duster. "Ruth, tell the doc to bar the back and keep a lamp low. If strangers press, you scream like the devil's riding a wheelbarrow." He strode into the alley. Frost bit his nostrils. Somewhere a dog barked itself hoarse. 2 silhouettes broke from shadow, their coats wrong for the county, their hats too new. They froze when they saw him. One smiled slow, revealing a gold tooth that didn't match his eyes. "We're lost," the man said, "looking for the undertaker." "You found him," Kane replied, lifting the Colt. They ran. He didn't shoot, not yet. Bullets had their own appetites. He watched them vanish between barrels, heard a horse gather itself and go. When he turned back, Isaiah Reed stood in the alley mouth with his little ledger clutched to his chest, like scripture. "You can't protect both," the clerk said, honest terror cutting the quaver out of his voice. "Not your brother and the book. If the marshal lights a match to either, the truth dies." Kane felt the badge in his palm. It spun once and came up showing its star like an answer, and nothing like one. "Then we'll move the truth," he said, Tonight. They re-entered the courthouse to find the hall empty, the air suddenly sweet, lamp oil heavy, too heavy. Kane's nostrils flared. "Isaiah," he said quietly, "did you leave those lamps burning?" The clerk shook his head. Beneath the office door, a thin yellow thread crawled along the floor like dawn. Kane pushed the door. Flame bloomed at the baseboards in a soft, greedy roll. Paper curled black along the bottom shelf. The county ledgers first, of course. A window had been nailed shut from the outside. The boards thudded under Kane's fist and didn't give. Smoke climbed the walls in long, elegant fingers. Somewhere out on the street, a voice called, "Fire!" and the town answered with a rising murmur. Dugan's silhouette crossed the frosted glass like a dark bird. Kane grabbed the shadow ledger from Isaiah's arms and shoved it beneath his coat. Heat licked his cheeks. He turned toward the door, and it slammed hard from the other side. The bar dropped with a wooden cough. Through the pane, past his own reflection, he saw a match flare and a cigar tip burn bright. Then the marshal's voice, lazy as a summer creek. "Let it burn, Sheriff." The flames breathed in, as if drawing strength. Then they roared. Flame took the room like a patient animal finally loosed. Paper curled on the shelves, ink blistered and ran like dark tears, and the nailed window breathed smoke back in their faces. Through the wavy glass, Marshal Dugan's cigar burned a fox bright point, steady as a star that didn't care who prayed beneath it. "Let it burn, Sheriff." Kane didn't answer. Heat stroked his cheeks. Resin and lamp oil clawed his throat. Isaiah Reed clutched his shadow ledger to his chest, like a hymn book at a hanging. "Back," Kane barked. He ripped the county seal, heavy brass on an oak handle, from the desk, and swung. Glass burst into bright sugar and fell away. Smoke shouldered past them to gulp winter air. The window frame had been cross-barred from outside. "Move," he said, and smashed again. Wood screamed. A spark leapt from shelf to curtains and ran them in a breath. Isaiah coughed until he folded. Kane grabbed the clerk by the collar, jammed his own duster over the man's head as a hood, and drove the brass seal like a wedge. The crossbar gave with a coughing crack. Cold slammed into the room in a white rush. They climbed through into the alley as the records office exhaled a deep, greedy roar behind them. Out on Main, the courthouse vomited smoke into a sky the color of unpolished pewter. The church bell tolled, thin, frantic, while men formed a bucket line from the horse trough, boots hammering boardwalk seams. Ash drifted like black snow. Dugan stood on the steps with 2 dragoons, coat immaculate, brim beaded with frost. He saw Kane emerge, saw the singed edge of his duster and the clerk's scorched hands, saw, Kane was certain, the shape of a ledger under the coat. "Sheriff," Dugan called, voice high enough to carry, "you set fire to the people's records to hide your brother's crimes." The crowd turned by inches, like a herd feeling a new pressure. Faces Kane knew from christenings and graves looked suddenly like strangers' masks. Banker Locke stood at Dugan's elbow, watch chain winking, mouth shaped for grief. Judge Pritchard clutched a handkerchief like a flag of surrender and nodded solemn as a tomb. "That's a damned lie," Kane said, smoke rasping his words. "Your match lit that fire." Dugan lifted his hands, palms out. "I've got a dozen witnesses who'll swear I was in the square when you went inside, Sheriff. I even sent men for the pump. I serve the Republic. I don't burn its books." He turned, speaking to the town as if he'd been elected to them in secret. "Black Rock, your sheriff harbors a killer, resists federal pursuit, and now destroys your records. The law will not be mocked." Pritchard cleared his throat and unrolled a paper that had the wet shine of fresh ink. "By authority vested in me, I hereby suspend Sheriff Jonathan Kane, pending inquiry on charges of obstruction and arson. Deputy Caro is named acting sheriff until such time." The paper blurred into a smear of white. For a heartbeat, Kane heard only the slow slap of buckets, the hiss of steam, Eli's breath in another room like a thread pulling thin. Then boots hit the boards, and Deputy Caro mounted the courthouse steps, hat crushed in his hands. His Adam's apple worked hard. Soot dusted his cuffs. Kane's gaze snagged on a fleck of gray canvas caught in Caro's heel tread. Half a stenciled O, like the mark on Sutter & Co. crates. "John," Caro said, not quite looking at him, "lay down your iron. It's only until the judge sorts this." He held out a hand. No call to make a show. Kane let his badge spin once between thumb and finger. It caught firelight, then frost. "Is that what this is, Harlan? A show?" Caro's face twitched. Dugan stepped in him like a shadow stepping into shade. "Don't make your friend choose, Sheriff. Choice is a hard thing in front of a crowd." "Here's mine," Kane said softly. "Doc Halverson's got my brother with a bullet in him. Any man tries the surgery door before sunset answers to me." A murmur went through the line of men with buckets. A woman crossed herself. A boy sucked ash like sugar off a mitten. Judge Pritchard lifted the paper higher, as if it made a wall. "Kane," he quavered, "you are relieved. Your very words are armed defiance." Dugan's smile never moved. "Arrest him." Caro hesitated. The dragoons did not. Two stepped down, shackles ringing like spoons in a drawer. Kane caught the gleam and felt an old cold slide into his bones, the memory of gallows rope creaking in wind, the knot that looked like a mouth whispering last words. He drew the Colt a finger's width. Every rifle in the square jumped to life. The world narrowed to circles. His front sight, the brass of Dugan's badge, the small bead of sweat trembling in Caro's ear. Ruth came running from the surgery, apron flecked with iodine, eyes white wide. "Sheriff." Men nosed the back alley. "One has a marshal's rosette. Doc says they'll push through as soon as it gets dark." She realized where she was and who she'd spoken against and swallowed, flustered. "Beg pardon, your honors." Dugan made a little gesture with two fingers. "Mercy for young fools," he said, and the crowd chuckled thin. Kane slipped the Colt back into leather and held out both hands, palms up, empty for the town to see. "Listen to me," he said. "If I go to the jail now, those men will go to the doctor. My brother will die, and Black Rock will learn what it is to live under a badge that serves a ledger." He raised his chin toward the courthouse. "You smell it? That's ink burning. That's your deeds and births and marriages singing to ash. Who profit when a town forgets who owns what? Who tell you law is a thing their fingers hold?" He pointed at Locke's chain, at Pritchard's handkerchief, at the pretty curl of Dugan's cigar smoke. These men. Silence, broken only by buckets, and the slow susurrus of paper collapsing into embers inside the records room. Then Mrs. Henderson, boarding-house widow, spine like a fence post, stepped from the line and set her bucket down with care. "He brought my boy home in a sheet after the Kansas gang shot him," she said. "He didn't hide the truth. He made me look at it." She faced the judge. "I'll look again if I must, but I'll not see him clapped in irons so another man can walk a doctor's rooms." Others didn't move, but they didn't move toward Kane either. Sometimes in a small town, the bravest act is a woman setting down a bucket. Dugan took the measure of it and didn't push. "All right," he said brightly. "Let the people have their show." He tipped his cigar toward the smoldering door. "Acting Sheriff, escort your predecessor to the jailhouse quietly. The federal men will visit the surgery under lawful warrant while we tidy up." "No," Kane said. "Yes," Dugan said, and his eyes went as pale as old ice. "Take his gun, Caro. By law." Caro came down the steps, slow, a man walking into winter water. He stopped within arm's length, close enough Kane could smell flour and fear on his breath. "John," he whispered, "don't make me." "You chose," Kane said gently, and tapped the soot at Caro's cuff with 2 fingers. "You were at the window." Caro flinched, as if struck, and reached. Kane stepped in, turned, and the shackles meant for him kissed Dugan's dragoon in the jaw instead. The man folded with a surprised sigh. Smoke gusted. The crowd's gasp went up like pigeons. "Run!" Ruth cried, and Kane did something worse. He ran toward the gallows. He hit the steps, 2 at a time, and took the platform in one long stride. From there, the town lay like a map, alley lines, roof angles, the square's geometry of fear. He yanked the bell rope from the church rail where someone had tied it off, and flung the free end over the gallows beam. The thick hemp whipped and sang. He hauled, and the alarm bell answered, a brazen clang that rattled glass. "Bucket to the roof," he shouted, and men moved without thinking, because a voice from a gallows sounds too much like judgment to ignore. The bell pounded time. Smoke's breath changed. Flame lost interest in the records room and lifted its head elsewhere. For a dozen heartbeats, Blackrock forgot Kane and remembered not burning down. In that forgetfulness, Kane was already off the scaffold. He cut through the backs of men like a fish cutting current, down the alley where crates towered, Sutter and Co. in their telltale crooked serif, and along the surgery's brick flank to the rear door. Ruth had barred it with a broom and a steel bed frame. "He's fevering," she blurted. "Doc says if he don't sleep, he won't see sunset." "Lamp low," Kane murmured. "Water ready. Keep that back window unlatched." "You ain't going to surrender," she said, part fear, part awe. "I ain't going to let law wear a murderer's face," he said. He reached to touch her shoulder, a ghost of a gesture, and stopped, hands empty again. Through the thin wall came Eli's voice, rough, threadbare. "You always loved a stage, brother, even if you pretend you don't." "Rest," Kane called, and the word felt like a prayer he'd never been taught. Boots ground in the alley gravel. Shadows pooled under the eaves. Dugan's rosette man spoke soft, satisfied. "By order of the federal marshal, open." Kane stepped into the little back room where the iron wash basin sat, where a coil of shackles lay tarnished on a nail, kept for drunks and men who woke mean. He lifted them. "Wait," hummed his palm. He looked at his badge in the lamp glow, its star dulled by smoke and time. "Law ain't always justice," he whispered, then set the badge beside the shackles on the windowsill, like 2 arguments waiting their turn. The rear doorknob turned with a lazy click. "Open or we break it," the voice said. "By whose right?" Kane called. "By mine," Dugan answered from the alley, cigar smoke preceding him like a herald. "And by yours no longer." The bar bowed under a shoulder. Wood squealed. The broomstick splintered and fell. Kane drew, leveled, and the lamp flame found his steel-gray eyes. "Doc," Ruth cried from the other room. "They're coming?" The bar gave with a hollow pop. The door leapt inward. Federal blue filled the frame. Sheriff Kane squeezed the trigger. Dawn found the town holding its breath. Frost steamed from the horses tied along Main Street. The gallows rope creaked in the chill, and Sheriff Kane stood in the street's empty spine with 2 weights in his hands, the silver badge he'd polished in the dark, and a scuffed tin of cartridges that had belonged to his brother. A red wind came down off the pines, sharp as a file. He tasted rust, pine pitch, and the sour tang of last night's whiskey on other men's breath, drifting from the saloon. Luke, his brother's boy, waited beneath the jailhouse eaves, eyes red-rimmed, coat thin, jaw set like a man trying to hold back a flood. "Uncle," he said, voice raw, "don't do this. Pa ain't here to answer. Don't drag his name through the street." The boy's fingers worked the brim of his hat until the felt crumpled. Kane let the badge spin once on his thumb and forefinger, the metal catching milk-white light. "Go on home, Luke." His voice was low, even. "Home is gone," Luke whispered, and the truth of it hung between them like a noose. Inside the jailhouse, the pot-belly stove ticked and breathed. Deputy Harlan Finch sat behind the desk, boots on ledger, stale tobacco crawling up from his shirt. 2 cells held their own weather, one with a shivering drifter who'd seen too much, the other with a ragged trapper boy whose hand was wrapped in blood-dark cloth. The boy had been the one to whisper of a night hunt in the pines, of signals flickering like foxfire among the firs, of a bullet meant for someone else, until Sheriff Kane's shot cut his own blood down. "Morning," Finch said, chewing. His eyes slid to the leather folio under Kane's arm. "Judge'll want them papers. The judge can wait." Kane crossed to the steel, the cold bars biting his palm. The trapper looked up. Smoke-gray eyes, terrified and stubborn both. "You ready to put words to what you saw?" Kane asked. "Not if it means you hang your brother twice," the boy muttered. His breath smoked in the cold like a little train. "Town's whispering, Sheriff. Says your kin ran with the same men hanging their lanterns like stars in those trees." A boot heel tapped the porch. A shadow fell. Territorial Marshal Alden Pike stepped in, rain-dusted coat, long as a coffin lid, a printed warrant he folded in one gloved hand. He smelled of saddle soap and ironed paper. Behind him clanked men with clean rifles and cleaner faces, authority, boiled and starched. "Sheriff Kane," Pike said, voice polished to a shine. "By order of the court, you're removed from any investigation touching the death of one Eli Kane." He lifted the warrant, let it rustle. "Turn over your badge and your files. I'll see to justice." Kane studied him the way a man studies a rattler he can't yet see the head of. "You'll see to something," he said. "Question is what?" Pike's smile showed no teeth. "Law, Sheriff, not grief, not family." His eyes flicked to Luke at the window, then back, pleasureless. "It's a mercy, truly." Kane placed the folio on the desk and loosened the thong. Ledger pages blinked up with neat ink. Quantities, routes, night marks, a hunter's sign. He showed a page with a sketched arrowhead, the same little mark that had been carved into Eli's old powder horn when they were boys. Luke's breath hitched behind him like a colt pulling up lame. "That dog won't hunt," Finch said softly. "You don't put your own kin on paper." "You do," Kane answered, "when the paper's a tally for other men's sins." He tapped 3 names that marched beside the marks. A railroad agent, a mine foreman, and, soft as a sigh, Judge Beaumont of Dry Gulch. The room's heat seemed to move to the corners and hide. Finch shifted his boots off the ledger. Even his chewing slowed. Pike didn't blink. Old lists or old rumors, nothing admissible. Hand over the badge. Luke seized Kane's sleeve, fingers burning through the duster. Don't. A tremor ran up the boy's arm. He's all I got left. Kane had spent nights asking himself if that were true of the man he shot in the black under the pines. Eli's face a smear of shadow and breath, the shape of a hunter where a brother should have stood. He felt the weight of the pearl-handled Colt at his hip, the scabbed memory of recoil in his wrist. Wind thudded the shutters. The gallows rope outside groaned like an old man turning in his sleep. "Law ain't always justice," he said, the words falling into the stove heat and catching like dry shavings. "But justice rides with me." He fixed Pike with his winter-gray eyes, and it rides today. He walked past Pike without shouldering him, one hand closing on the folio. Outside, the street felt colder, cleaner. Every door cracked an inch. Canvas rustled on wagon hoops. He mounted the courthouse steps, the abandoned one at the square's end where swallows nested in the eaves, and sunlight made ladders out of dust motes, and pushed through the doors. Air hung like old parchment. The judge's bench sat empty. Its varnish bubbled where a lamp had tipped years ago. Crossbeams held shadows like jurors. Kane took his brother's hunting knife from his belt. He pinned the ledger page, the one with Eli's arrowhead mark, to the door with a hard, single drive of steel. The thunk traveled down his bones. He pinned the judge's name beside it, then the agent, then the foreman, hammerless nailing, knife, palm, wood. The paper puckered and held. People gathered, shopkeepers with flour dust on their sleeves, a blacksmith's apron spattered with coal, the schoolmarm with chalk moons on her fingers. They read. Silence deepened until even the coughs died, replaced by a sound like snow falling, the private slide of 100 thoughts rearranging. Luke watched from the last step. He looked smaller than his hat. "You're killing him again," the boy whispered, not to be heard and heard by everyone. You're hanging him on paper." Kane's jaw worked. He could picture Eli sitting cross-legged by the fire as a boy, knife-cutting arrowheads from scrap tin, both of them laughing at the hard glitter. Could picture the man he'd become. Jaw like a stone, boots silent in the hush of fir needles, running other men's routes by night. "I'm hanging the men who used him," Kane said, and felt something in his chest tear and keep tearing. "There's a difference." "Big speeches," Pike said from the doorway. He hadn't bothered to remove his hat. "But what you've done is slander the bench, and surrendered your office." He nodded. Two of his men fanned left, two right. Finch came in slow, hand easy near his holster, mouth small. Kane lifted his badge. For a heartbeat he saw it as a coin he could pay for his brother's name. A bright lie to purchase quiet. He could say the ledger was smoke. He could ride Luke north tonight and let Dry Gulch rot under its own perfume. He could bury the arrowhead mark beside Eli's bones and call it love. He pinned the badge to his breast instead, the steel clicking the star back into its home. "This is my town," he said, gravel under the words. "You want to unmake that, Marshal, you better bring more paper." A bottle burst somewhere behind the crowd. The sound made folks jump, and then laugh too loud. The laughter died when a lantern shattered high, glass ringing like a bell, and black smoke unfurled across the plaster sky. A rifle cracked from the belfry where pigeons roosted. The shot shaved splinters off the judge's bench, spit light from the badges pinned on the wall to honor old dead sheriffs. Women shrieked, then choked them back. "Down," Kane barked, grabbing Luke, shoving him toward the rail. He moved without thinking, counting angles, windows, the thin line of smoke drawn by wind that had to be sneaking under the eaves from the west. Another shot banged, plaster pocked. The trapper boy in the back cell of the sheriff's office would be hearing this. He'd remember the bite of shots in the pines. This auditorium had no cells, only echo and varnish and ghosts. Kane saw the glint of a scope up in the belfry shadow and squeezed off a round. Brick spat mortar dust. The glint vanished. Below, Pike used the panic to push forward until his gloved fingers touched the pinned papers. His hand came away ink-stained. "Arrest him," he said, cool as lake water, on contempt and corruption both. Finch hesitated. He looked at Kane, then at the crowd, then at Pike. A vein beat in his temple. He took out shackles and the iron sang softly, heavy links knocking together like a short chain dragging across a floor. "Harlan," Kane said, almost gently. "Orders is orders," Finch muttered, stepping in. He smelled of stale leaf and a fear he'd never name. Kane lifted his wrists. Iron met bone. He let Finch close one cuff. The teeth bit the steel ring with a ratchet-smug little music. Then something cut the music off. A child's cry from the back, high and unpracticed, and the crowd broke to show the Apache girl who'd been sleeping in the church loft. Eyes wide, braid loose, palms out. She'd been the one to tell Kane, haltingly, of lantern codes and fat pay on nights the hunters rode. She stared at the badge on his chest, as if it were an animal she couldn't decide to trust. They come again. Tonight," she said. "Big wagons, judge men. Take the trail by the old Gallows Creek." Pike's face thinned to wire. Enough of this circus. He reached, fast, for the papers. Kane doubled the cuffed arm, drove his shoulder into Pike's chest, felt the marshal's breath leave him like a kicked bellows. Finch swore. Guns rose. Muzzles black as yawns. Kane pivoted, iron chain clanging like a strike on an anvil, and used the cuffed wrist as a hook to wrench Finch off balance and drag him between the guns and the crowd. Men stumbled, cursed. Someone fired wild, blowing a square of daylight out of a window. The courtroom filled with splinters and smoke and the hot ticking smell of burnt oil. He didn't shoot Pike. Not yet. He shot the rope over the side door instead. The rope that held the courthouse's side gate bar in place since the doors had swollen in last spring's rains. The shot cut the rope. The bar dropped. The door sagged open to wind and white sky and the clamor of doves. "Out!" Kane roared, and townsfolk streamed for it, skirts snapping, boots hammering. Luke dragged in the surge like a stick in floodwater. The Apache girl clutched her shawl and fled at the last second, eyes never leaving Kane's. "Sheriff," Pike coughed, pushing to his feet, eyes wet and furious. "You're finished." Kane backed toward the judge's bench, left hand cuffed, chain hanging, gun steady in his right. He pushed his brother's knife deeper into the papers on the door, deeper into Eli's name, until the hilt quivered. Then he spoke, without raising his voice, letting the words find every ear left in the room. "Tonight," he said, "we take the judge's trail. Bring chain for living men, not ghosts." A bell began to toll. Once, twice. Then the notes strangled into a broken clang that made every neck snap up. The shooter in the belfry wasn't shooting anymore. He'd cut the bell rope instead, and the slack rope dropped, hissing, heavy, and swung through the courthouse hatch to coil like a pale snake over the empty judge's chair. The rope's end wore a clean noose, and as dust drifted and the bell's last moan died, the noose twitched, cinched tighter, like a throat had just taken its first weight. Night came like a lid sliding on a coffin. The wind dropped into the alleys and held its breath. Frost skinned the horse trough with a thin glare that cracked under the first thrown bucket. The abandoned courthouse crouched at the far end of the square, its belfry a black shark's fin against a sky dusted with faint stars. Kane stood in the mouth of the alley across from it, hat brim wet, duster salted with ash, counting the seconds between the groan of the gallows rope and the whisper of men setting positions in the dark. Ruth was beside him in a shawl, face ghost pale, clutching a lantern with the wick turned low. Isaiah Reed held his little ledger under his coat, as if it were a child. The Apache girl, silent as snowfall, watched the courthouse windows without blinking. Luke hovered at Kane's shoulder, boy thinness wrapped in a man's stiffness. He'd refused to be sent home. There was no home to send him to. He wore Eli's old hunting knife at his belt, the tin arrowhead charm tapping his hip when he breathed too hard. Wagons will take the judge's trail by Gallows Creek, the girl whispered. English careful, eyes never leaving the belfry. They flash lamp for gate. 3 short, 1 long. Kane nodded once. When you see it, tell me. On the square, the invitation had gone out. Town meeting. A reconciliation, Marshal Dugan had said. Come hear the truth and put away fear. People came because that's what people do when authority calls their names. Banker Locke stood by the door with a folded smile. Judge Pritchard wrung his kerchief. Pike's men flowed among the crowd like dark water. Kane could smell lamp oil and lamp black, and something else that soured his mouth. Blasting powder. Sutter & Co. crates sat stacked under the courthouse portico, like pews waiting for worshippers. You sure? Isaiah whispered, fog puffing his lenses. They'd blow their own records hall to hell. They already tried, Kane said. He tapped the ledger hidden at his ribs, and they missed. Inside, voices rose, then fell, the legal cadence of men who owned the ink. Kane crossed the square at a walk that said he had the right, climbed the courthouse steps, and slipped into the vestibule's shadow. The big room glowed with lamplight turned down to soft. It was a church made of law, benches, rails, the empty judge's chair, and the noose of the severed bell rope coiled like a pale snake over the varnished wood. Pike stood at the front with his hat off, eyes bright, voice gentle. We gather to name a grief and to keep our town from turning on itself. We all loved Eli Kane in our way, and we all respect his brother's service. But we must have order. Dugan leaned on the rail as if he owned it, cigar painting a small orange heart in the dim. Order first, he said, almost kindly. Fire next. Kane's hand slid to the Colt. He tasted pine pitch and old smoke, and remembered his father saying, Rope is the last word, son, not the first. He eased the hammer down. The Apache girl tugged his sleeve from the shadows behind him. 3 short, she breathed. 1 long at the creek. Right then, the town clock struck 9. Each toll crawled over the square and into the room, a slow, iron promise. Between the 4th and 5th bell, Kane heard something under the floor, a moth's sigh of a fuse being drawn through powder. He turned his head a degree. The glow under the benches wasn't spill. It was a line, a thread of heat pulling a red worm's eye toward the front. Sutter & Co. stamped the underside of the benches, too. Clever men had hidden canisters under hymn boards. The moral weight dropped into his chest, like a millstone. Pull iron and pan the room with bullets, and the first splash of hot lead could make the whole courthouse a hymn of fire. Do nothing. and the fuse reached its amen. "Ruth," he whispered, "take Isaiah. Unbar the side door I shot loose today. Start a river, quiet and steady. Women first." She nodded once, jaw hard, and slipped into the warren along the wall. Isaiah followed, small ledger tight to his ribs. Kane stepped into the aisle. "Folks," he said, voice even as river rock, "walk, don't run." He pointed to the side door as if he'd just noticed it. "Lamp smoke's rolling wrong. Let's take air." Every face came up like sunflowers turning. Dugan's eyes cooled. Pike's hand inched toward his belt. Banker Locke's smile pinched. "Mr. Kane," Pike said, soft. "You're a guest." "My town," Kane replied, "and you've got a fuse hissing under your seats." The word fuse worked faster than any sermon. Men lifted benches. Women lifted children. The first thin stream of people moved toward Ruth's cracked door. Panic wanted to run. Kane's voice cut it into steps. "Steady, one line." He felt the shift more than saw it. The line of rifles leaning along the back rail, muzzles tilting a hair toward him as if drawn by a lodestone. Dugan nodded the fraction of an inch. Two of his dragoons melted along the wall to block the side exit. The threat of fire under the benches winked and crept. "Marshal Pike," Kane said, letting the badge's star show and not shine. "Order your men to clear a path." Pike's gaze ticked to Dugan, to Locke, to the judge. Authority ricocheted. Then he smiled and showed a scrap of paper held up like a sacrament. "By lawful warrant, I take custody of one Sheriff Jonathan Kane for inciting riot and slander of the bench." Somewhere behind the bench, a hammer cocked. The sound found every spine. Kane drew breath. "Law ain't always justice," he said, quiet but shaped to carry. "But justice rides with me." Luke moved then, too fast, too brave, dropping to his knees and sliding under the front pew, knife in his fist like a promise. The boy's shoulder bumped a crate. The fuse, spit to either side, burned brighter, hissed. "Luke!" Kane started forward. A gun bellowed from the gallery. Wood burst in white chips an inch from Luke's ear. He froze. Deputy Finch stepped out from the aisle shadow with his hands up, voice ragged. "Hold fire, there's powder all through." Caro, soot still in his cuff seams from the afternoon, snarled and shoved a pistol at Finch's ribs. "You shut your mouth, Harlan." Finch swung on instinct, forearm up, muzzle shoved aside. Bang, hot light, screams. The shot took a kerosene globe. Tongues of fire ran the brass rail. Smoke climbed like an old, triumphant god. Chaos tore its mask. Folks shoved. Benches toppled. Pike swore, turning to cover his own men from their own stupidity. Dugan's cigar winked out as he moved in a neat half-circle toward the judge's chair, where the noose lay like a choice. Kane fired once. The round punched a hole, clean through the powdered fuse, and smoked it to a black curl. Another thread glowed on the far side of the aisle. 4 serpents hunting the same nest. He couldn't shoot them all without sowing flame into the floorboards. "Luke," he barked. "Cut wood, not wick. Drop the crates." The boy's knife slashed. A crate crashed. Canisters rolled with a tinny thunder. Sparks skittered and died between his boots. 2 dragoons lunged to grab him and met Kane instead. The Colt coughed twice. One went to his knees, shocked. The other fell into the pew with a sound like a sack of nails. At the door, Ruth slammed her shoulder into a dragoon, and Isaiah tripped him by pure accident and terror. People poured into the night, gulping cold. "Locke," Kane shouted across the bedlam. "You financed this. Stand up and own it." Locke went pale as altar wax and tried to slide behind Dugan's coat. Dugan smiled without joy. "Mr. Locke is a patriot," he said. "You'll call him Banker or Sir." "Sir suits rope," Kane said. He raised the Colt and knew he could end the cigar man right there, put him down in front of the noose he loved. He almost did. Then he saw the girl in the aisle, Apache braid loose, hands spread, standing between his muzzle and men with badges because she didn't know which animal to fear more. He didn't shoot. Moral choice is a silent muscle. It tears quiet. The floor shuddered. Out beyond the square, the Apache girl's lantern code answered from the creek. 3 short, 1 long, and then the heavy breath of wagons coming. Tarps humped like sleeping beasts. Sutter's mules labored into town. The shipment and the cover story had arrived together. "Positions!" Pike roared, and for the first time his voice was pure, stripped of polish. He saw it. The two-front war he hadn't ordered. A town inside about to ignite, and a convoy outside that would damn him if it was seen. Kane moved with the moment. He grabbed the bell rope, flung its noose over a rafter, and hauled. The belfry bell took the line, arose, and then slammed down, clang, an alarm that ripped through the room and out into the square. Doors flew wide. The town saw what it was not supposed to. Wagons with the Sutter mark, pulling to the courthouse like sinners to a font. Miners, mothers, boys, Black Rock turned its head and its heart at once. Gasps went up like birds. Someone yelled, "Thieves!" Someone else, "Hang 'em!" Dugan stepped to the judge's chair, and with a little flourish as neat as the cutting of a ribbon, threw the noose over a ceiling hook and tossed the free end to Caro. He pointed at Kane. "Do your duty, acting sheriff. End this blasphemy." Caro looked at the rope, then at the town, then at the door where wagons scraped their brakes. His mouth worked. He might have chosen. The floor glowed. Luke's foot had kicked a keg. The cracked seam burped a lazy flame that found spilled powder and smiled. Fire spidered under the bench in a sudden hungry rush. Kane dove, swept Luke up, and rolled. Heat kissed his cheek. Finch dropped to slap at Sparks with his hat. Ruth dragged an old wet tarp from a bucket corner and flung it. The tarp took, smoked, and smothered one bright seam. But another worm of fire went racing forward beneath the judge's dais, straight toward Sutter and Co. "Out!" Kane roared at the last of the crowd. "Now!" Out on the square, the first wagon tried to back, jackknifed, and jammed the line into the courthouse steps. The mules screamed as men yanked at traces. Banker Locke vanished. Pike sprinted for the door to cut the wagons loose, his warrant fluttering from his pocket like a white moth. Dugan stood, very still, watching flame and townsfolk, with a gambler's calm, a man who had wagered a building and maybe won a county. Kane saw the fuse reach the dais. He threw Luke into Ruth's arms and ran. The floor hummed under his boots. He dropped to both knees, shoved his hands into the glowing seam, and pinched the fire as if it were a snake's neck. Heat blistered him to the bone. The flame went black, then flared between his fingers like spite. He thought of Harlan Kane saying rope last, of Eli whispering, "Badge your blood," of the bell crying to a sky that never answered. He lifted his burned hands to his mouth and blew like a man trying to bring a coal to life and bring it to death instead. It died. A breath, one, of relief tumbled through his chest. Then the fuse that wasn't a fuse. Another line he hadn't seen under the judge's chair, caught the corner of a dropped lantern, flared, and zipped straight into the belly of a big Sutter keg, as neat as a signature. Kane saw it, and saw that he would not reach it in time. He stood to take the blast. The courthouse floor heaved up like a chest taking its first breath. And then everything went white. The blast chewed sound out of the world and spit it back in pieces. First there was only white, and the soft patter of ash falling like dry rain. Then came the ticking, glass cooling, lamps dying, then the screams. Kane lay on his side, against a pew leg snapped to a fang. The floor heaved once, settled, and breathed smoke. His hands throbbed meat red where he'd pinched fire. Blisters sang under his skin. He tasted lamp oil, pine pitch, and the copper of his own blood. The bell rope swung above him, its noose tracing slow circles in the smoky dark. "Luke," he croaked. The boy answered with a cough from somewhere under the ruined dais. Kane crawled, palms on splinters, coat smoking at the hem, and found him wedged beneath a beam, eyes wild, face gray with powder. Kane dragged him free. Ruth appeared out of smoke, with a wet kerchief over her mouth, and dragged both of them toward air. Isaiah stumbled after, jacket smoldering, clutching his little ledger to his chest, as if it could burn and still be proof. Outside, the square was bedlam in cold moonlight. One Sutter wagon burned like a forge, paint bubbling, tarps slumping, mule traces snapped and whipping at nothing. People swarmed and scattered. The gallows rope creaked in a wind that hadn't been there a minute ago. The courthouse windows frothed with black. "Waterline," Finch rasped, face streaked with soot, hat gone. "Bucket, hand to hand." Pike lurched from the doorway with a cut at his temple, and his warrant singed to lace in his fist. "Keep back," he barked to no one, to everyone. His eyes found Kane, then the wagons. Calculation moved in him like a shadowed fish. He started for the traces to cut the panicked mules loose. Dugan walked out slow as a Sunday, coat cindered at the hem, cigar gone at last. He held a pistol low, and the banker lock huddled behind his shoulder, a child hiding in a wolf's silhouette. Judge Pritchard was nowhere. The judge's handkerchief lay in the street like a surrendered flag trod to gray. The Apache girl stood where Kane had left her, ash in her braid, eyes wide and unblinking. She pointed at the exposed guts of a splintered crate. Shackles glinted inside, iron cold as moon. Beside them, paper edges curled and blackened, indenture contracts, names, markets, prices written in a calm hand that believed ink could forgive anything. "By thunder," an old rancher whispered, hat in his hands. They were aiming to sell folk on paper. "Lawful debt collection," Locke stammered, voice thin. "Misunderstood commerce. Sursuit's rope," someone said darkly. Dugan raised the pistol, not at the crowd, at Isaiah. "That little book," he said, voice hoarse and reasonable. "Bring it here and walk away." Isaiah clutched the ledger tighter until his hands shook. Kane stepped between them without thinking, the world narrowing to the weight at his hip and the cold ticking of his badge against his ribs. Smoke made his eyes water. It could have been grief. "Marshal Pike," Kane called, not looking away from Dugan. "Do your job." Pike stood with his knife half through the last trace. Breath steaming, the mule's eyes rolling white. Authority had split down the middle of his face. Both halves wanted to win. He glanced from Kane to the crates, to the people who had watched him polish law like a spoon. He saw the iron and the contracts, and the burned wagons that said he'd been outplayed by the men he thought were on his side, or by the man he'd thought he could manage. "Deputies," Pike said, voice low and hard at last. "Seize the banker, on my authority." Two of his men moved, unsure but moving. Locke squealed and tried to merge with Dugan's back. Dugan shoved him away without shifting his barrel. "Traitor," he sneered at Pike. "You don't get to walk back clean. You were there when we stamped the seals. You signed the freight." Pike flinched like the words had teeth. Something cold passed behind his eyes. He raised his pistol at Dugan. The square tightened like a noose. "Drop it," Kane said to Dugan. "End this with breath instead of blood." Dugan's mouth turned up, not a smile. "You dropped your breath in the pines, Sheriff, when you shot your own kin." He flicked his muzzle toward Luke, then toward Kane's blistered hands. "Your family's always been collateral." Kane's scar itched under the soot. He heard Eli's voice as it had been by lamplight years ago, angry and young and certain. He heard his father's, tired and kind. He heard the night gallows creaked, and a boy bled in the dirt by a wheel. "Rope last, son. Rope last. Law ain't always justice," he said quietly, and felt every ear catch the words. "But justice rides with me." Dugan moved first. He swept his muzzle toward Isaiah's chest. Kane shot him through the shoulder where the meat breaks a draw. Dugan spun, fired wild, and the round took Finch in the thigh. Finch went down, swearing. Pike fired. Dugan staggered. Locke sobbed. The Apache girl didn't flinch. Caro lurched out of smoke with his gun up, and seeing only the shape of a man in a duster with a pistol, fired at Kane and missed him by inches, hit the bell rope instead. The frayed end leapt, struck Kane's hat brim, and left a black kiss of soot. Dugan fell to one knee near the gallows steps, pistol clattering away. Blood soaked his coat, dark on darker. He tried to push to his feet, and couldn't. He looked up at Kane with a kind of sick admiration. "Quicker on the draw," he rasped. "Always were." Kane aimed center mass. Behind Dugan, Luke's small, raw voice rose, cracked, and carried. "Don't kill him, Uncle." The boy's eyes burned like two small coals in the ash. "Don't make me bury two men for the same sin." The square held still as a held breath. The noose swung, a pale circle, a question mark. Ash fell with patient grace. Kane lowered the gun a hair. He could hang Dugan on the spot and call it mercy for the afflicted. He could arrest him and watch records vanish and witnesses disappear between tonight and dawn. Either way, blood would lie. Either way, the badge would weigh more. "Chain him," Kane said, voice flat. He kicked Dugan's pistol away and signaled to Pike with a tilt of the barrel. "Alive." Pike hesitated only a second before nodding. He handed his weapon to a deputy and snapped irons on Dugan's wrists himself, jaw tight as wire. Caro stood with his gun half lowered, eyes hooked to the rope like a moth to flame. Ruth bound Finch's leg and swatted his curse aside. Isaiah finally breathed and loosened his white-knuckle grip just enough to keep from breaking his own book. Fire gnawed the courthouse from inside. Paper went up in soft shrieks. Kane knew the ledger pinned on the judge's door was gone, and most of the pages under his coat mere scorched ghosts now. Isaiah's little ledger smoked. He hugged it tighter. The wind shifted and carried a burned scrap across the square. It skittered to Kane's boot and stuck there, a corner of a name and a line of numbers in that tidy, careful hand. Proof enough to hang a man. Not enough to change a system. Doc Halverson. Ruth gasped, eyes filling. "He sent me. Eli, he—" The words died behind her teeth. Her hands fell open helplessly. Kane closed his eyes and found the dark waiting for him like an old friend. The noise of the square blurred. He saw the pines again, frost smearing the needles like lard, his brother's mouth working around truth and regret, the way Eli's hand had gripped his wrist like he was the last post of a broken fence. When he opened his eyes, the town was watching him like a jury that hadn't agreed on the verdict and didn't think it ever would. "Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson said, voice steady as a hymn, "what do we do now?" Kane looked at the gallows, the jailhouse bars, the scorched courthouse door. He looked at Luke, at the Apache girl, at Isaiah's little book. He lifted his badge from his chest with his left hand and felt its quiver, hot metal, soot, guilt. "We start a record you can't burn," he said. He nodded at Isaiah. "Copy what lives onto many hands." He pointed to the shackles in the crate. "Melt those into plow bolts." He met Pike's eyes, and we walk this man to the cell one slow foot at a time, with the whole town watching. Some folks nodded, others didn't. A few spat into the dust. A child cried somewhere behind the smithy. The bell didn't ring. The rope moved on its own. They walked. Not triumph, not shame. Just the long pull of a town hauling itself back from a cliff it hadn't noticed it had stepped off. The jail door yawned. The lock turned. Dugan sat on the bunk and smiled through blood like a man who knew secrets could always be buried deeper. "Much obliged for the hospitality," he said. In the doorway of the surgery, under a lamplight the color of weak tea, Doc Halverson met Kane's eyes and shook his head once. Kane nodded back as if he'd been told the price for something he had already bought and could not return. Wind rose and carried the ash away. The night settled its ache over Black Rock, and the bell rope's noose, pale in moonlight, hung like an unfinished sentence. He washed his hands in a pan beside the jail until the water went red, then pink, then clear enough to see his own face ripple. The badge lay on the sill between a heap of shackles and a sprig of winter sage Ruth had left without saying why. In the quiet after fire, every sound was too loud. The tick of the stove, Luke's chair scraping the porch, the soft hoof stamp of a horse waiting for an answer. He had chosen the badge tonight, and he had chosen blood. Both choices cut. The law had burned in front of him, and still he had said it aloud. "Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me." Justice had not felt like victory. It had felt like blistered hands, like a noose that refused to stop moving, like a brother's name curling into ash and taking the proof with it. Tomorrow they would argue what he was. Savior or murderer, man of rope or man of record. He did not have votes to cast on that. He had only what his father taught. The rope must be the last word, and what Eli's death had written. The last word costs. He picked up the badge. It felt heavier because it was. He pinned it on anyway. The wind shifted. Somewhere a bell tried to ring and didn't. He whispered to the empty room, to the ash and the iron, to the long, lonely road. Ride, then. And he did.